I was sitting in that garage. And in the house I had paid for in full 27 years ago, they were celebrating my grandson's 5th birthday. I could hear the clink of glasses, the forced laughter, and the lazy hum of a Bluetooth speaker playing some fun pop song I didn't know. I knew for sure that this song hadn't been chosen for him. It had been played for the parents, for the guests, to create the right impression. I was sitting in the garage, all alone. The folding chair creaked as I moved. The concrete under my shoes was cold, still stained from the can of transmission fluid I had knocked over 2 years ago. My old set of wrenches lay open on the workbench, one of the wrenches half wiped, half forgotten. And I was the one who had been asked to wait until the guests had dispersed. Ingrid thinks it might confuse the kids. Klaus had told me that morning, without looking me in the eye, "It'll just be easier for you to be in the garage today." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I'd learned a long time ago that a nod is the universal response when no one wants to hear your voice. Easier. That's what they always say before they push you aside. It's just easier. The smell of barbecue wafted through the crack in the door. Someone laughed. A child squealed with joy. For a moment I thought it was my grandson, Oscar. But it wasn't him. It was someone else's child. The kind Ingrid called playful. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the thermos I'd brought out earlier. Black, still warm. I was ready for this exile. Not that I expected it, but something about the way Ingrid had avoided the word "Dad" when she spoke to me all week told me that I wouldn't be needed today. Not in the way that it mattered. The garage wasn't dirty, but it wasn't visitor-ready either. Dust covered the upper shelves and cobwebs clung to the far corners. But it was mine, or at least it had been. I had spent years under those beams, adjusting carburetors, replacing brake pads, repairing neighborhood kids' bikes, and even teaching Klaus how to change the oil when he was still listening to me. I sipped my coffee and stared at the far wall, where a faded photograph of my late wife, Helga, still hung on a rusty nail. Her smile was quiet, private, as if she knew something no one else did. She had never loved Ingrid. She said she was polite, like the kind of person who mentally redecorates a room you built yourself. The music in the house got louder. A man's voice. It must have been Chef Ingrid, the one with the white teeth, bragging about how lucky this boy was to have such modern parents. Modern. I knew what that meant too. The side door opened a few inches. Klaus stuck his head out, his voice low. "Hi, Dad. Just checking to see if you're okay. Do you need anything?" "No, I'm fine," I said, setting down my cup. "Cool. Ingrid says, thanks for giving us space today. Just until they take the pictures. Then maybe you can come over for the cake. We'll let you know." "Maybe." He closed the door before I could answer. The latch didn't click, but it might have. I leaned back in the chair, which groaned under my weight. A single fluorescent light hummed faintly overhead. Outside, the sun was bright, warming the driveway. Inside, I was a relic in the soft light, boxed up like a seasonal tool no one had the heart to throw away. It would have hurt more if I didn't already know. Last week, I overheard Ingrid talking on the phone as she walked around the kitchen, thinking I was outside trimming the hedge. She said, "Once we get the paperwork done, we can start looking at options near Ridgewood. A bigger yard, a better school district. We just need to work something out with the old man. Work it out like I was a math problem they hadn't learned to solve." I didn't ask Klaus about it. I didn't confront any of them. It's not my style. Not now. I've learned that if people lie with smiles long enough, they start to believe that the truth doesn't matter. But the truth does matter. It waits. It listens. It accumulates. I stood up and walked slowly to the back wall of the garage, past the cabinets and dusty holiday decoration boxes, to the tool chest built into the wall. I reached for it and pulled out a flat folder wrapped in a tarp. Inside were all the documents they thought I didn't care about anymore, the original title deed, the 1995 transfer of ownership, and, most importantly, the clause I had added in 2004 after Helga's death. This clause required the signatures of both owners for any sale or transfer. My signature was never on the one Ingrid had submitted. She knew I had intentionally left it out. They didn't know I had a copy. They didn't know I kept the lawyer's business card. They didn't know that harmless old Ludwig was in the garage watching, listening, and quietly preparing. They thought they were closing a chapter. But I had just turned the page. The music in the house reached its peak. Then the singing, fake, cheerful, showy. Happy birthday, Oscar. I closed the folder, pushed it back into the trunk, and returned to my chair. When the singing ended, I waited, but the door never opened. I wasn't surprised. I looked down at my hands. The calluses were barely visible, but still there. Not from recent work, but from decades of work, the kind that builds homes, not just houses. I thought about the swing set in the backyard. I built it for Oscar 2 years ago in 40-degree heat while Klaus was away on business and Ingrid was too busy to measure cement. When it was finished, they had a barbecue. They told their friends they found it online and put it together themselves. I never corrected them. That was the beginning of my erasing. Not loudly, not harshly, just quiet omissions. Greeting card signed, from Mom and Dad, even though I had paid for the gift. Vacations where I stayed home to take care of the house. Photos where I was cut out. Slow deletion. I read somewhere that betrayal doesn't start with a knife. It starts with an empty chair. I stood up and opened the garage door a few inches. The air was thick with summer heat and the smell of barbecue sauce. A balloon broke loose and wobbled against the porch railing. I saw Oscar running around the yard with 2 other boys, laughing. He was wearing a t-shirt that said Big 5 Energy, in bubble letters. Ingrid walked alongside the camera. She didn't look up. Klaus was standing by the grill, wearing an apron, a beer in his hand, talking to a man in golf shoes. I stepped back inside and let the door close. There was a knock on the garage wall, soft. It was the neighbor's teenage daughter, Molly. She leaned in through the side window. "Mr. Ludwig, you okay?" "Just fine, sweetheart." She hesitated. "You want a piece of cake? I can sneak one out." I smiled. "Maybe later, but thank you." She nodded and disappeared. The youngest always notices, before they learn to ignore. I sat again and stared up at the ceiling beam. On it was carved a tiny heart with the initials L+H. Helga and I had done that in 1979 when we finished converting this garage. It wasn't just a place to store stuff. It was a sanctuary, workshop, office, a safe place. I whispered to that beam now, like she could hear me. They think it's theirs, but they don't even know what it means. Outside, laughter swelled again. Inside, I waited, but the door never opened. They still call me Mr. Fix-It, though now it's mostly a joke, a harmless label they toss around when a drawer sticks or a faucet leaks. Ludwig can handle it. Ludwig's good with tools. Ludwig's still useful for now. But there was a time when that name meant something. I wasn't just good with tools. I was the man people came to when they didn't know where to begin. I built things. Not just shelves and fences and engine mounts, but a life, a home, a sense of order in a world that got messier by the year. The kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard because what he built stood tall enough to speak for him. That kind of man doesn't disappear overnight. He just learns when to wait. I remember when we poured the foundation for this house. It was me, 2 friends from the base, and a rented concrete mixer. Helga brought out sandwiches and lemonade, even helped hold the rebar when our arms gave out. She always said the house would settle over time, but she never worried. Things you build right don't collapse, Ludwig. She used to say that, and it stuck with me. That's why I kept everything, every receipt, every blueprint, every deed revision since 1986 in triplicate. It's why I could walk into the garage today and, blindfolded, still find the torque wrench or the key to the old truck. The day Klaus turned 16, I handed him that truck, the same one I rebuilt from scrap, engine, carburetor, every inch of it sanded and restored with my own hands. I put the title in his name, Clean. I thought it would teach him pride and responsibility. He totaled it 6 months later chasing a girl through a red light. He walked away without a scratch. Said it wasn't his fault. And maybe it wasn't entirely. But that was the first time I realized he didn't see things the way I did. Didn't understand what it meant to build something, to bleed for it, and to treat it like more than a placeholder. That difference grew louder over time. I never minded that Klaus took a different path. He went corporate, wore suits, talked about leverage and margins at Thanksgiving. I didn't care. But what I did mind, what dug into my chest like a rusted nail, was how he began to rewrite the story. How suddenly the swing set Oscar plays on became something they ordered online. How the backyard was renovated by the contractor. How "We built this family together" became the script even when my name wasn't part of the chorus. There was a shift, a subtle one. At first, it was Ingrid casually forgetting to thank me when I rewired the patio lights. Then, it was Klaus using "we" when discussing mortgage payments I'd made in full. Eventually, it was both of them referring to the house as theirs, exclusively, confidently, like I was just part of the decor. The old coat rack that no one moves, but everyone agrees doesn't match the rest of the room anymore. I would have let it slide, maybe, if it weren't for the envelopes. I found them the morning after Oscar's party. Ingrid had left them half buried in the kitchen junk drawer, sandwiched between expired coupons and dried-up pens. I wasn't looking to snoop. I was looking for a working Sharpie. But what I found was more permanent than ink. The top letter was from a real estate agency, Cameron and Riley. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Harlow," it read, "attached are the preliminary documents for your review. As discussed, we've omitted the current occupant from marketing language to maintain buyer neutrality." Below that, a flyer draft with photos of the living room, the kitchen, the backyard with the caption, "Modern charm, flexible ownership." And then the sentence that made my chest clench, "Garage currently used for storage." Storage. That was when I knew they weren't going to ask me to move. They were going to assume I'd already gone. I didn't say anything that morning. Not when Ingrid cheerfully asked if I'd mind heading to the hardware store so she could vacuum uninterrupted. Not when Klaus muttered, "We'll keep you in the loop, Dad," without ever specifying what loop I was in. Instead, I walked into the garage, closed the door, and sat at the workbench just like I'd done 1,000 times before. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the old tan file. Inside was everything, the property tax history, the deed transfer forms, and tucked neatly near the back, the notarized addendum I filed after Helga passed. It wasn't flashy, just one paragraph, but in bold, black print, it spelled out exactly what they'd forgotten. Any sale, refinancing, or title reassignment required my explicit signature. No exceptions, no workaround, and my signature. It wasn't anywhere near the paperwork Ingrid had printed. They thought I'd forgotten, that I didn't keep track. Old men don't read fine print. But I did. I always have. Still, I didn't act right away, because I wanted to see how far they'd go. Call it cruelty. Call it caution. I call it clarity. I started watching the mailbox. Ingrid was careful to collect it at first, most days, but every once in a while she slipped up. I saw a notice from the appraisal company. A reply from Cameron and Riley asking for confirmation on showing dates. A single post-it note that said, "Final walkthrough by 17th confirmed." Ludwig's schedule. My schedule. As if I were the cleaning crew. I went to the local bank that afternoon, opened a safety deposit box, and moved the original documents inside. Not because I feared they'd take them, but because I wanted control, tangible, key-in-hand control. I even visited Nate Hirschman's office. He still practiced part-time. We sat across from each other at his desk, and I slid the copy of the clause toward him. He squinted through his glasses, then chuckled softly. "Still have this?" he asked. "Of course," I replied. "Still enforceable?" "Absolutely." He leaned back. "Want me to call them?" "Not yet." "Waiting for the moment?" he asked. I nodded. "Waiting for them to write the ending. Then I'll give them the epilogue." 3 days later, Klaus approached me with a folder in his hand and guilt behind his eyes. "Dad, I wanted to talk to you about some future planning. Just cleaning up paperwork, streamlining stuff. No pressure, just a few signatures." I took the folder, flipped it open, and scanned the first page. It was a quitclaim deed. My name was listed, and so was a line for my signature, but not a line for discussion. "Let me read this over tonight," I said evenly. "Of course," he replied, with all false casualness. "No rush." That evening, I took a red pen and drew a single line through the signature box. Then I wrote, reviewed, declined. I placed it back in the folder and left it on the kitchen counter. The next morning, neither of them said a word. They had underestimated the man with the toolbox. They forgot I still owned the nails that held this house together. They forgot I once turned a blank lot into a home with nothing but sweat, a hammer, and Helga's steady hand pointing where the windows should go. They forgot that while they were busy upgrading countertops and scrolling Zillow, I was listening, measuring the angle of their intent like a carpenter checking the slope before it caves. They still don't know what I've done. That's fine. The best repairs are the ones people don't notice until the structure stands firm and they realize they couldn't change it even if they tried, because I built this and I don't sign things I don't believe in. The envelope was thick, like it had something to prove. Klaus slid it across the kitchen counter one Tuesday morning the way a salesman might slide a brochure toward a hesitant buyer. He didn't look at me, just sipped his coffee, scrolling something on his phone like this wasn't the climax of a month-long betrayal, just some basic paperwork. "Title clarification," he said, too casually. "Streamlines things, you know, for when we refinance." He said it like he was doing me a favor, like I was the messy footnote on a clean financial plan. I took the envelope without a word, nodded like always. He smiled, relieved, and walked off to his video meetings in the back office, the same room Helga and I used to call the reading room, back when the house had softness. I didn't open it right away. I took it out to the garage with my coffee, sat down at the workbench, and stared at the flap for a long time. Paper was never just paper in this family. Not when it came with so many assumptions hidden inside. When I finally opened it, I used my old pocket knife. Clean cut, no tearing. I read every page like I was stripping down an engine, slowly, deliberately, with the knowledge that one missing bolt could cost you everything. The language was polite, but polished and sharp. Terms like transfer of primary interest, streamlined co-ownership dissolution, and expedited transaction authority. Buried in there, Clause 6. 4. My name removed from all future sale negotiations with a single signature. One stroke of the pen and I'd vanish from the records. And the kicker, they'd already filled out the signature line with my name in faint gray ink, waiting for me to trace over it like some obedient ghost. I didn't feel angry. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was thinner, quieter, like standing in a hallway where all the doors had been shut softly, one by one, over time. They thought I wouldn't read it, or wouldn't understand it. Or worse, they thought I'd sign it just to stay useful. I tucked the papers back inside the envelope, wrote, "Let me sleep on it," on the front, and left it in the kitchen beside the fruit bowl that no one ever ate from. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch instead, watching the yard. The grass was too green. Ingrid had hired some service to modernize the lawn, whatever that meant. The swing set I built for Oscar stood quietly under the moonlight. I remembered sanding each piece by hand, staining it with the same color Helga picked out for our deck. She always loved the walnut finish. She said it looked like dignity. I don't think anyone even noticed. In the morning, Ingrid cornered me while Klaus was at work. She had a mug in one hand, and her smile sharpened to a fine edge. "Hey, Ludwig. About the paperwork. Just wanted to make sure you weren't confused. It's just to make things cleaner when the house transitions. You'll still have your space. We'd never do anything that affects you." I looked at her and saw it. Not malice, just presumption. The kind that grows when people mistake patience for passivity. I said, "Appreciate the concern. Still want to review it with someone I trust." She tilted her head, her smile tightening. "Of course. It's just, we've already made some progress with the buyers. They're expecting things to move quickly. We'd hate for them to think the house isn't unified." "Unified," I repeated. She nodded. "You understand?" "I do," I said. "More than you think." That afternoon, I drove to Nate's office again. He greeted me like he'd been expecting the visit. I laid the packet on his desk and sat down. He didn't rush. He read it all, every page, every sentence. Then he leaned back, whistled low, and said, "Well, Ludwig, they've got nerve. I'll give them that." "Is it enforceable?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not without your signature. Not with that clause we filed in '94. They'd need your consent, which I assume you're not giving. Not unless hell freezes over." He smiled. "Good. Then here's what we do." We spent the next 2 hours crafting a response. Not a threat. Not yet. Just a polite letter, firm, legal, absolute. It explained in dry, undeniable terms that I remained a legal co-owner with full veto rights, that no sale, refinance, or title action could proceed without my express consent. It was the kind of letter that made realtors blink twice and buyers walk away. We sent copies to the agency, to Klaus and Ingrid, and to the county registrar for good measure. Nate also filed a quiet title freeze on the property, standard precaution when ownership is disputed. It wouldn't stop them from trying again, but it would buy me time. When I got home, Klaus was in the driveway, pacing on his phone. I could hear his voice from the street. "I don't know what happened. He was supposed to sign." "No, I didn't push him. I just told him," then he saw me and froze. "Hey, Dad," he said, stuffing the phone into his pocket. "Just checking in. Everything good?" "Letter went out today," I said. "You should be getting it by tomorrow." He looked like someone trying to smile through a root canal. "Right. Cool. I'll, look for it." For 3 days, the house was quieter. No talks of listings, no jokes about upgrades. Ingrid stopped leaving brochures on the table. Klaus stopped pretending the refinance was about streamlining. On the 4th night, he knocked on my door. Not the garage, my actual bedroom door. That was new. I opened it and saw a man I didn't quite recognize. He had the same face, the same posture, but none of the confidence. "Dad," he said, "I think I owe you an apology." "Only if you mean it," I replied. He looked down. We didn't think it mattered that much. You've always been so hands-off. We figured you'd be okay with it." "That's not an apology. That's an excuse." Silence stretched between us. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. What were you planning to do if I had signed?" "Sell, move to Ridgewood, use the equity for the next place, put some away for Oscar's college, and me?" We figured you'd come with us. Into what? The basement. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I closed the door slowly. The next day, Ingrid tried a new approach. She left a handwritten note on the kitchen table. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper with my name on it. It said, "I know things have gotten tense, but we really do care about you. We just wanted a fresh start for the family. We thought you'd understand. We thought you'd want that, too." I stared at it for a long time, then wrote 2 words on the back. Fresh starts require honesty. I placed it where she'd left hers. Later that week, I noticed the sign was gone from the front yard. The online listing vanished. The emails stopped arriving in Ingrid's inbox, at least the ones I could hear through the thin hallway walls. A strange stillness settled into the house, like everyone was waiting for something to break. It wasn't me. I wasn't the one who bent this family out of shape. I was just the one who kept it from collapsing. People like Ingrid always mistake civility for weakness. They think silence is permission. That if you don't fight back loudly, you won't fight at all. Old name, new name. Sharon Ingrid. Ryan Klaus. Ethan Oscar. Elaine Helga. Nate Hirschman Hermann Richter. Jack Ludwig. You see, some men learn patience from fighting wars, but I learned mine from years of having a wrench in one hand and a disappointment in the other. I never raised my voice, never broke anything, never caused a scene. I just sent a letter. And just like that, the pity they had for me vanished, because pity only sticks around when you've got no power. Now they looked at me differently. Not like an old piece of furniture, or just part of the background, but like a man who actually had a say in things. And man, did they hate that. Respect doesn't come easy. Sometimes, it shows up only after a good shove. So I just kept to myself, cooked my own meals, and gave the garage a good cleaning twice a week. I even drove Oscar to school once when they both had meetings. The boy gave me a hug and told me my breakfast sandwiches were the best he'd ever had. That was all I needed. One afternoon, I was sitting out in the yard with a cold drink, watching the sun cast long shadows over the swing set I built. I could hear Ingrid's voice inside on a call. She said, "No, we're not selling anymore. Family business got messy." Then she let out a tight, empty laugh. That was the exact moment I knew they'd given up. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. And all I had to do was hold on to a single signature they never got. The morning after my letter went out, I went into that garage with a new sense of purpose. It wasn't bitterness, not even a lick of anger, just a quiet sort of confidence, like a guy picking up a tool he hasn't touched in a while but always keeps ready. I hit the lights. That low hum from the fluorescent bulbs used to bother me. Today, it sounded like a license to operate. I started with the filing cabinet against the far wall. It had a big dent in the side from years ago when Klaus tripped into it chasing a football inside the garage, even after Helga told him not to. He must have been 9 years old. He cried not because it hurt, but because the crash scared him. Helga kissed his forehead and told him, "Every dent tells a story." I never pulled that dent out. I liked it right there. Some things are meant to stay, just a reminder of what happened and who was there. I opened the top drawer and pulled out the old blue folder marked, Harlow Residence Ownership. I ran my hand over the cover, my thumb tracing the edge like it was a worn-out Bible. Inside, everything was just as I'd left it: tax history, the deed, updates, contractor receipts, Helga's death certificate, and even a picture of us standing on the porch after the last of the shingles went up. Her handwriting was on the back in blue ink, "Ludwig, we built this." It wasn't romantic. It was better than that. It was true. Underneath that folder was another one. Inside was Hermann Richter's business card, 3 signed copies of the co-ownership clause, and my favorite, an email printout from 2011 where Hermann said, in no uncertain terms, this clause protects your authority as long as your name is on the deed. Do not remove it under any circumstances. I hadn't. What really hit me as I looked at the documents wasn't how complicated everything was, but how simple they'd tried to make it. A few pages, a couple of signatures. That was all it took to wipe a man from the house he poured his life into. And that's exactly what Ingrid had tried to do. Erase me with convenience, with formalities, with the soft, quiet violence of proper paperwork. But paperwork cuts both ways. I grabbed a clean, yellow legal pad and started writing. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. My mind was clear, my hands were steady. My notes weren't filled with feelings. They were facts, the dates Ingrid brought up the refinance, the morning Klaus left the envelope, the time they said the "figure out the old man" line, the day the house was listed online, the documents I found in the junk drawer. I labeled it, Chain of Quiet Intent. I wasn't going to court just yet. But if it came down to it, I wouldn't show up with memories. I'd show up with a file. Later that afternoon, I called Hermann again. He picked up on the second ring. "Organizing your arsenal?" he asked. "Already done," I said. We talked about the next move. He suggested I file a notice of contested title, to make it crystal clear to the county that any sale without my okay would lead to a lawsuit. I agreed. It was quiet, smart, and effective. The kind of move they wouldn't see coming until the buyer's agent called them in a panic. After the call, I sat back down and took a good, long look around my garage. Everything was right where I'd left it, the pegboard with the screwdrivers, the rusted vise on the corner of the workbench, the calendar that still said, March 2018, with a picture of a classic Mustang. I never turned that page. Helga passed away that April. I guess I didn't want to see the days without her in them. But now, maybe I did. I pulled the calendar down and tossed it in the trash. Not because I was trying to forget her, but because I remembered her so well that I didn't need the pages anymore. By the end of the day, I had 3 neat folders: legal, historical, and personal. I put them in the fireproof safe under the workbench, locked it, and put the key in the drawer beneath my wrench set. That drawer hadn't moved in 40 years. Neither had I. That evening, I heard the front door close harder than usual. Ingrid's heels clicked fast across the hardwood. A few seconds later, Klaus opened the garage door. Not all the way, just enough to lean through. "Dad," he said. His voice was quieter than normal. Not mad. Careful. "You filed something." "I did. The buyers pulled out. The agency dropped us." "I'm aware." He scratched the back of his neck. "Look, I know you think we went behind your back. But it wasn't like that, was it? We just thought maybe you'd be ready for a change. You're alone a lot. The garage, it's not a retirement plan." "I'm not looking for a plan," I told him. I already had one. It was this house. He looked around the garage like he was seeing it for the first time. His eyes landed on the photo of Helga still pinned to the beam. "We were just trying to simplify," he said. "For whom?" He didn't answer. I didn't push. I just pointed to the workbench behind me. "There's a copy of the documents if you want them. Everything I filed. Everything I never signed." He didn't move, just nodded, then backed out the door. 3 days went by without a word. Ingrid wouldn't make eye contact. Klaus left early and came home late. Oscar started staying out of the kitchen when I was in it, not out of meanness, but out of confusion. The silence in the house stretched thin and brittle, like a pane of glass waiting to shatter. Eventually, something had to give. It did on Saturday. I was screwing a wobbly leg to a table in the hallway when Oscar came over, holding a juice box and a legless Lego figure. "Grandpa," he asked, "are you in trouble?" I looked up. "No, kid. Why does Mom say you made it difficult for us to move? I put down the key. Do you like it here? He shrugged. This is my room. That's a good enough reason to stay, I said. He thought for a moment. Can I still come to the garage? I smiled. Always. That evening I had dusted the old chair next to my workbench. It had been Helga's place, where she would come to talk while I worked, sometimes reading a magazine, sometimes just sipping tea. I had dusted it off and fixed one of the legs more firmly, just in case Oscar ever wanted to sit down and ask questions, just in case anyone in this house still wanted to learn how to build things. The next morning I found a folded piece of paper tucked into the crack under the garage door. Ingrid's handwriting. It said, "We understand. We're not selling anymore. But I hope you know this wasn't easy for anyone. We didn't mean to hurt you. We just didn't know how to turn you on. No apologies, just explanations." I read it twice, then threw it in the trash next to the calendar. If you have to explain your silence after the fact, it means you've chosen it too long. Instead, I pulled out a folder labeled Personal and added another document to it, the letter I'd written that day to Oscar. He wouldn't read it for years, but I had to write it. It said, "When people try to move on without you, son, sometimes you have to remind them that you're still standing. You don't have to yell. You don't have to threaten. You just have to stand still and let the weight of what you've built do the talking." By the end of the week, Ingrid had taken the "Welcome to Ridgewood Schools" brochure off the refrigerator. Klaus had cancelled his mortgage appointment. The tension didn't go away, but it was starting to shift from frustration to something that resembled respect. They didn't talk to me much, but they stopped talking for me, and that was enough for now. I arrived at the diner at 9:02 a.m. 2 minutes late. On purpose. There's little power in not being the one already sitting and waiting. I walked past the blaring grill and the waitress calling everyone cute, and saw him exactly where I expected him to be, a corner table at the far left, under a faded photograph of a train station that hadn't existed for 3 decades. Michael Weiss still wore his half-ironed shirts and his 2-inch wide ties, but he was sharper than most blades and older than most insults. He looked up from his legal pad and smiled. "Ludwig Gale," he said, half standing up. "You look exactly like the kind of man who doesn't knock when they try to push him out." I sat down in the booth opposite him. "Good to see you too, Mike." He waved the waitress off with 2 fingers, "Coffee, black for both of us," and opened his briefcase. "So you found the point. I wrote it with you, didn't I? 21 years ago." He nodded. "Back when Ingrid still called you Dad instead of Ludwig," with that fragile smile. The coffee arrived. I didn't touch it. Mike pulled out a folder. "Not mine, his. I've been following your site ever since you mentioned the tension last Christmas. Public records, debt activity, school transfers, regular lawyer business. Nothing aggressive, but they were checking this house out, Ludwig. Quiet. No sign out front, but I have 3 marked MLS entries and an agent's request to the Ridgewood firm." I didn't blink. "They use a financial trust to move the names. The trust owns the house. They own the trust." "Only they don't," I said, "because I never signed the reassignment." He smiled. Not a warm smile, but a legal one. The kind lawyers give when they see an opportunity. "That's right. And if you're ready to stop sitting quietly in garages, I have a plan." I leaned in. "Let's hear it." He laid it out in 4 parts. Clean, precise, legal. First, verify ownership in the county records, citing the lack of the required signature. Second, block any future listing or transfer with a quiet title lawsuit. Third, send a polite message to Ingrid and Klaus. Legalistic, but civil. Fourth, post an anonymous interest in the property. Make them think a buyer is already circling. "They'll be fussing," Mike said. And when they come to you, you don't argue. You don't explain. You just sit there with a smile and say you're considering your options. I stirred my coffee but didn't drink it. What about Oscar? Mike softened. You always go back to the guy. He didn't choose this. No, but he's watching. And what he sees now will be the story he carries later. I looked out the window. A minivan was parked at the entrance. 2 toddlers were fighting over a plastic dinosaur in the back seat. I remembered Klaus at that age, smearing peanut butter all over the walls of our first house, laughing when Helga scolded him, then hiding behind my feet. I turned. Put it together. That's it. Mike nodded and began to write. It was already noon when I left the diner. I walked home the long way. Past the hardware store. Past the alley behind the old post office. Past the bench where Helga sat with her sketchbook, drawing birds on Saturdays. By the time I got to the house, the balloons were gone. The grill had been wiped clean. The only thing left of the party was a chalk drawing on the sidewalk, 3 smiling figures and a 4th, smaller one with big glasses. A drawing of Oscar. I stopped on the steps and heard the door open. It was Ingrid. Her voice was as sweet as cough syrup. Oh, Ludwig. We were just talking about you. I thought so. She gestured awkwardly. We're thinking about maybe having a little meeting sometime soon to discuss, well, house business. I smiled. I'll get my lawyer. That stopped her. Excuse me? You'll want yours too, I added. Trust me. She blinked twice, then forced a smile and carefully closed the door. I went into the garage and closed the door behind me. Later that night, Klaus knocked on the door himself. Dad, what's going on? I kept my eyes on the blueprint I had unfolded on the workbench. Not the house blueprint. No, it was older. A blueprint for a vintage conversion. Oscar's bike hung on a hook behind me. I think you know, I said. He came in, his hands in his pockets. We didn't think you cared. You were always so quiet. Quiet doesn't mean absent. I think so. He looked at the bike. Is this for Oscar? I nodded. He asked me last month if you could pass on bikes. He said his next one had to have a soul, not just a serial number. Klaus sat down on the edge of the workbench. Listen, I didn't know Ingrid had gone this far with the trust. I thought it was just paperwork, a way to simplify. They always call betrayal simplification. He swallowed. Are you going to block everything? I turned to him. Do you want me to do it? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he whispered, I'm sorry, Dad. That got the point across, but it was gentle. I didn't say I forgave him. I didn't say I wouldn't continue. I simply handed him the key and pointed to the blueprint. Hold this tight, I said. For the next 40 minutes, we worked as we used to, tools in hand, no words needed. When he left, I didn't follow him. I stayed behind, polishing the frame, adjusting the brake cables. Because some fixes require more than tools. They require silence, intention, and time. The kind of time you earn by sitting still long enough for the truth to reveal its weight. Outside, the porch light went out. Inside, in the garage, I wasn't a guest. I was home. And this time, the door would only open on my terms. The sun had long since set when I heard their car pull out of the driveway that evening. A chorus of goodbyes had echoed through the house earlier. Laughter, promises to do it again soon. The clatter of paper plates being tossed into garbage bags. I hadn't left the garage. Not when Oscar opened his presents. Not when they cut the cake, and never when Ingrid's voice came from the back porch, saying, "Don't forget to grab a piece on the way." I knew they wouldn't come looking for me. Not really. Around 9:30 p.m., the house finally fell silent. Old name, new name. Sharon Ingrid. Ryan Klaus. Elaine Helga. Mr. Darnell Mr. Brenner. Jack Whitmore Ludwig Steiner. The Bluetooth speaker went silent, the light on the porch clicked off, and the deadbolt on the front door turned with a final, heavy thud. Klaus and Ingrid were headed to bed, and me. I was just getting started with my work. There's a certain music to dealing with paperwork, a rhythm in the rustle of folders and the sound of a pen on a page. After Helga passed, I handled all of it, the insurance, the transfer of her estate, everything with our joint bank accounts. It's not that I ever liked doing paperwork, but I respected it. Paper, unlike people, doesn't forget. That night, I opened a beat-up old metal box I kept under the workbench, a box that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were 37 folders, each one labeled with Helga's careful handwriting. Mortgage, title, trust fund, living will, even the receipts from the kitchen remodel back in '94 when we tore down that wall and put in the wide window she loved so much. Most men my age, they lose track of things. They misplace details, dates, and important papers. I don't, and that's a fact they'd forgotten. I laid everything out across the workbench, a whole map of memories and legal facts. I knew Ingrid and Klaus had started to get the house ready for sale. The signs were everywhere, hushed calls behind closed doors, sudden trips into town for errands that always ended in tense silence. And of course, that phrase they kept using, once we get the paperwork finalized, we can start looking at listings. They thought I had no idea, but I knew. What they didn't know, what they'd failed to check, was that my name was still on the original deed. After Helga's funeral, in a moment of shared grief, Klaus and I had agreed to a co-ownership clause. At the time, it felt like a symbol, a way to carry her memory together. But I took it a whole lot more seriously than that. The next week, I went back to the lawyer and added a specific addendum: no sale, no transfer, and no loans without the written consent of both owners. My consent was never asked for, and yet they were moving forward as if I didn't even exist. So, the next morning, just after the sun came up, I made a call. Not to yell at them. Not yet. I called Mr. Brenner, my lawyer for nearly 30 years. His office was in a tiny, squat building next to a dry cleaner, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking. But his memory was as sharp as a tack, and his filing system was even sharper. Ludwig Steiner, I said when he picked up. There was a pause, then he said, "Well, I'll be damned. Ludwig, how are you?" I didn't answer. I just said, "You still have the paperwork from 2004, the amendment to the deed?" "Of course I do." "You want me to pull it?" "Pull it. Make a copy. And if you've got a minute, I'd like to come in." By 11 that morning, I was sitting across from Brenner, sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug that still had Reagan Bush 84 on it. He slid the copy toward me, paper-clipped and tabbed. "Your son's agent called me last month," Brenner said, giving me a look. "Said they were consolidating the ownership for resale, asked if you'd be willing to sign off. I told him I'd have to check with you first, then I never heard back." I nodded slowly. They thought I wouldn't notice. Well, they were dead wrong. By that afternoon, we had a plan. Not a fight, not a big confrontation, just a response. Brenner helped me file what's called a quiet title action, a legal move that would force the county clerk to revalidate the ownership, flag any attempts at an unauthorized transfer, and legally block the sale of the house until the dispute was settled. It was subtle, precise, and sharp as a knife, no drama, just the law, just enough to make their whole plan grind to a dead stop. The first sign that something had shifted came a week later, on a Wednesday, when Klaus got home from work early. He came into the garage looking sweaty and out of breath, his button-down sleeves rolled up like he'd just run from the car. "Dad, did you sign anything with Brenner?" I looked up from the workbench, calmly wiping grease from my fingers. Why would I? Klaus hesitated. Well, there's been a problem with the Ridgewood plan. Something about the county records. I waited. He shifted on his feet, looking uneasy. Ingrid's upset. The realtor's confused. They're saying the deed still has you listed as an active co-owner. That we can't do a thing until you sign off. I see, I said, then added slowly, and you were just going to come talk to me about this now? He opened his mouth, then closed it. I went back to the wrench in my hand. He stood there for another minute before turning and leaving. No door slam, no apology, but the silence said everything I needed to hear. That night, I opened the envelope Brenner had given me earlier. Inside was a notarized copy of the rider. I put it in the small safe under my tool chest. On top of it, I placed a photo of Helga and me from 1982, standing right in front of this garage, arms around each other, both of us sunburned and smiling. She used to say, "The world forgets too fast." She also said that dignity is something you protect before it's taken, not after. I understand that now more than ever. The next morning, Ingrid left a note by the coffee pot. "Can we talk tonight?" I didn't write back. Not to be cruel, but because the conversation they wanted wasn't the one I was ready to have. Instead, I spent the day doing something I hadn't done in years. I restored the garage. Not just a simple cleaning. I restored it. Old name, new name. Sharon Ingrid. Ryan Klaus. Elaine Helga. Mr. Darnell Mr. Brenner. Jack Whitmore Ludwig Steiner. Ethan Oscar. I swept out every last corner, gave the workbench a good polish, hung the wrenches on their hooks just so, and oiled the hinges on the cabinet door. I even fixed up the old stool with the torn cushion and rehung Helga's photo so it was perfectly straight. This place was mine, my own space, not a cage, not some old man's retirement cave, and not a place to collect dust. It was about time they remembered that. That weekend, they called off the open house that was scheduled for Sunday. A small paper sign stayed taped to the front window for a few hours before Ingrid came out and peeled it off, her jaw set tight. She didn't come into the garage. Neither did Klaus. But Oscar did. "Grandpa," he said, sliding in through the side door, holding a small toy hammer. "Can I help?" I looked at him, his bright eyes, his messy hair, his complete lack of any kind of plan, and I smiled. "Yes," I said. "Yes, you can." We spent the afternoon rebuilding an old birdhouse I'd made for Klaus when he was just 7. Oscar got to pick the paint color. I let him choose red. Helga would have laughed, she hated red birdhouses, but she would have understood. Because this was what a real legacy looked like. Not in square footage, not in listings, not in silence, but in work passed down from one hand to another, even when the house seemed to forget your name. Let them wonder why their plans got stuck. Let them stew in their quiet confusion. I wasn't done yet, but I had all the time in the world. Time and paper, and both were still mine. It started with a knock on the garage door, but not the polite kind. This one was all knuckles and purpose. "Ingrid." She didn't even wait for me to answer. The door creaked open, and her heels clicked on the concrete like periods in a sentence she hadn't written yet. "We need to talk," she said, her arms folded over a beige blazer she probably bought for some PTA meeting. I just stayed seated. I'd been polishing the same screwdriver for 15 minutes, just for the feel of it. "So you found the envelope then?" Her eyes got narrow. "What envelope?" I reached beside me and tapped the brown folder I'd gotten out earlier that morning. It wasn't hidden. It was right there in plain sight for anyone who was ready to see it. She took a step closer. "Ludwig, we've got realtors coming by. There's a contract in place." "You can't just, you mean the forged contract?" My voice didn't go up. I just leaned back in the chair that had become too familiar over the months, the one missing my signature. She hesitated, then straightened her posture. Klaus told me you agreed. That it was just a matter of paperwork. Klaus tells you what you want to hear. That hit home. I could see it behind her eyes. She stepped back like the air itself had gone stale. This is our future, Ludwig. We're not trying to kick you out. We just you want what's convenient. You always have. I picked up the folder and flipped it open to the clause. Here's the problem. This house, this garage, this land, it still legally needs 2 signatures to move forward. Yours, and mine. Klaus is your son. I nodded slowly. He is. But you're the one holding the pen. The silence between us stretched, a silence I'd come to know not as a surrender, but as a silent recalculation. Ingrid wasn't the type to yell. She was the type who'd smile while making decisions that cut like razors. You'd stop all of this after everything we've done for you? I tilted my head. What have you done for me, Ingrid? Humor an old man. List 3 things. She didn't answer. Just stood there, her jaw tight, her lips pressed into the same forced calm she used on real estate clients and waiters who got her order wrong. When she finally turned to leave, she said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." And that right there was her whole point, her mantra, her entire worldview. Harder than it needs to be. But I had lived through harder. Vietnam, Helga's cancer, the day we buried my brother, a housing collapse, a job layoff at 58, watching my savings bleed out while Klaus went to college and came back ashamed of where he came from. No, Ingrid. I wasn't making this hard. I was just no longer making it easy. 3 days later, Klaus came into the garage. No knock. Just that same heavy walk he had as a teenager when he'd broken the lawnmower or wrecked the back gate. He held a folder even thicker than mine. I talked to a lawyer, he said. I nodded. Me too. He sighed and sat on the stool across from me. Dad, come on. This doesn't have to get ugly. We just want a new start. Do you? He rubbed his forehead. Oscar starts kindergarten next year. Ingrid wants us to be in Ridgewood before enrollment opens. We need the timing to work out. I set my wrench down. You made decisions, Klaus, without me. You told your wife I was just a placeholder, a problem to solve. You told the bank I was retired and mentally checked out. You went behind my back. I was trying to protect you. I looked him in the eyes for the first time in weeks. No, son. You were trying to erase me. He didn't have a comeback. He just lowered his head, the way he used to when Helga scolded him after he'd snuck out. I built this place, I continued. Laid every tile, patched every leak, covered every bill when your startup failed. I paid off this house so you wouldn't drown in debt. He loves it, Dad, he said. I even built that sandbox for Oscar with my own hands. Then why, I asked quietly, was I not in a single birthday photo? That silenced him. We sat there, 2 men, connected by blood, but separated by choices. Choices that were now printed in a legal font and notarized by strangers. Finally, he asked, "What do you want?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted the silence to really sink in. I want acknowledgement, I said. Not an apology, not fake gratitude. Just recognition that I was never a burden, that I mattered, that I still do. He nodded. Okay. And I added, "You're going to call off the sale." His mouth opened, then shut. He didn't argue. Because if you don't, I said, pointing at the document, this clause right here? It goes straight to the zoning office. I'll file an injunction faster than you can say escrow. He looked like a little boy again. And for a second, I mourned that boy, the one who used to sit in this very garage and ask me why wrenches came in different sizes. But I didn't say it. Some lessons are best learned through a silent echo. A week later, the house got quiet again. No realtors, no emails, no guest tours, just life. Real life. Quiet meals, muffled footsteps. And Oscar was knocking softly on the garage door with a paper airplane he wanted to show me. I let him in. We didn't talk about the party or the photos or the cake I never got. We just built a new plane together, one that was better, faster, with sharper wings. And when he left, I picked up the envelope one last time. Not to reread it, just to remember. Sometimes the only thing louder than a confrontation is a simple refusal. And sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't rage, it's relevance. The leaves outside had started their slow descent into a sea of gold. It was the kind of autumn Ludwig used to know by the sound of a rake on the concrete, the smell of warm apple cider on the stove, and the low hum of college football on the garage radio. But this year, silence had taken the place of all that. The rake stayed on its hook. The cider never simmered. The radio just collected dust. Oscar started coming by more often now, which surprised no one more than me. At first, the visits felt like simple excuses, a little boy's curiosity. "Grandpa, can you help me fix the wheel on my scooter?" Or, "Mom says not to bother you, but do you still have that model train?" But I'd raised children. I knew the signs of a question waiting to be asked. The moment came one Saturday afternoon when the air was sharp and the light fell sideways through the garage door slats. I was polishing the antique compass Helga had given me in '83, her handwriting still faint on the inside lid, "So you never lose your way back." Oscar stood beside me, unusually still for a boy his age. "Grandpa," he said, his voice small. "Why don't you live in the house with us anymore?" I didn't flinch. I just slowly turned the compass in my hand, letting the light catch the brass. "I do live in the house," I said in a calm, even voice. "I just don't sit at the same table." "But why?" I looked down at the boy's face. It was honest, clear, and completely unplanned. The kind of question that hadn't been rehearsed at the dinner table. "Did someone tell you I don't belong there?" Oscar frowned, shaking his head quickly. "No. I like being here. You listen more. You never tell me I'm too much." I smiled. It was a soft smile, touched with sadness. Being too much just means you haven't found the right size space yet. The next week, Oscar asked to do his school project in the garage. "I need someone to help me build a volcano," he declared. "And Dad said he doesn't have time this month. And Mom said you're good with your hands." I raised an eyebrow. Did she say that with her mouth, or with her eyebrows? Oscar laughed. "Both. They built the volcano in 2 days. I taught him how to measure the right ratio for the baking soda mix, how to carve ridges into the clay to make it look real, not just a cartoon." At the end of the second day, while we waited for the papier-mâché to dry, Oscar asked, "Did you and Grandma ever fight?" I wiped my hands on a cloth. "Of course. All people who love each other fight." "Did she ever tell you to leave?" I looked out toward the yard. A squirrel danced along the fence, balancing with more grace than I felt. "No," I said. "But once, I thought about leaving." "Why?" "Because I felt invisible." Oscar was quiet for a long time. The question didn't sting. It just landed. "True. Clean." "I think so," I said softly. The following Friday, Oscar skipped dinner in the main house. Ingrid texted me with a clipped tone. "Please send him back in time for bed." That was the night it all went down. Ludwig was organizing his tools when Oscar came in without knocking. He shut the door behind him quietly, like a man walking into a church. "I heard them," he said. Ludwig didn't turn around. "Heard who?" "Mom, Dad, and Aunt Lacey on the phone." Ludwig paused. Oscar continued. They said once the papers go through, you'll have to move out. That maybe you'll take the hint and just sign. Mom said you're stubborn, but she's got people who can fix that. Ludwig finally turned around. The weight in his eyes wasn't surprise, it was a simple confirmation. And what do you think that means, Oscar? I think it means they're pretending you don't own this place. Ludwig pulled a chair over and told the boy to sit. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the clause, the one that changed everything. He placed it on the table like a final chess move. They forgot I wrote this. Or maybe they hoped I forgot it, too. Oscar read it carefully. So they can't sell without you. That's right. Then why do they think they can? Ludwig leaned back, folding his arms. Because when people tell a lie for a long time, they start to think the paper doesn't matter. Only the story does. Oscar's voice dropped to a whisper. What are you going to do? Ludwig's answer was slow. What I've always done. Wait. Watch. And build. That weekend, Ludwig received a formal letter. A request to vacate the property within 45 days. It came in a thin white envelope with Klaus's signature at the bottom, but the language was all Ingrid. Ludwig didn't say a word about it. He put it in a file labeled Noise, and went about his day. But something had changed. Oscar didn't smile the same way around his parents. He asked more questions. He noticed how Ingrid's words got sharp when she talked about Ludwig to other people. And he saw the discomfort in Klaus's eyes every time Ludwig came into a room. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Ludwig found Oscar sitting on the garage steps, his legs swinging. Grandpa, can I ask one more thing? Always. Why didn't you tell Dad no when he first started changing things? Ludwig thought for a long time. The rain pattered on the roof like fingertips on memory. Because love makes you quiet sometimes. You think if you just stay still, they'll come back around. Oscar didn't answer. He just reached into his backpack and handed Ludwig a drawing. It was a picture of the garage with Ludwig inside, sitting on a chair, and the words, "My safe place." That night, Ludwig sat at his workbench with the folder open, flipping through every page. Then he made a call to a man he hadn't spoken to in a decade. Michael Weiss, his former lawyer. We may need to talk about escrow, Mike. You ready to pull the ripcord? Ludwig looked at the paper Oscar had drawn, still resting beside the compass. Not for me. For the boy. The next morning, Ludwig emailed the original deed, the clause, and a signed, notarized affidavit from the lawyer about Helga's intent to keep legacy rights on the property. It was all dry legal language, but it meant one very simple thing: they couldn't sell. Not without a war. A week passed, then two. Ingrid started dropping more passive-aggressive comments at dinner. Ludwig, maybe the heater's acting up again. You sure you're managing okay out there? Klaus laughed too hard at her jokes. Oscar didn't laugh at all. Then one afternoon, Ludwig came into the house for a sandwich and found Oscar sitting alone at the kitchen table. They're mad at me, he said. Ludwig set the sandwich down. Why? I told them they shouldn't lie about what's not theirs. Ludwig sat beside him. And what did they say? That I don't understand grown-up problems. Ludwig nodded. Maybe you don't. But you understand grown-up pain. Oscar looked at him. Grandpa, when I grow up, will I forget what's right, too? Ludwig leaned forward and touched his shoulder. Only if you stop asking the hard questions. Outside, the leaves kept falling. But inside, something had begun to rise. The night before the hearing, I sat in the same chair in the garage. The garage that had slowly become my sanctuary, my waiting room, my war room. The swing in the backyard still creaked faintly in the breeze, though Oscar hadn't used it in weeks. I figured Ingrid told him it was too childish now. Or maybe she just didn't want him to remember who built it. On the workbench in front of me, a yellow legal pad sat under a stack of manila envelopes. Each one had a name on it. Each name had a lesson. Klaus. Ingrid. Oscar. And one final one with no label. That one wasn't for anyone still living. The deed was submitted. The hearing was scheduled. The court would decide tomorrow whether the attempted sale was legal. My name was still on the title. My clause, bless Helga for insisting on it, hadn't been removed. But Ingrid's lawyers had filed a claim of mental incompetence. They were trying to argue that I wasn't of sound mind when I reasserted the clause last year. I'd smiled when I read the motion because tomorrow I wouldn't have to say a word. The evidence would do all the talking. There were records. There were receipts. There were witnesses. And most importantly, there were the emails, dozens of them, that Klaus never thought I had access to. When he'd logged into the family computer, he never cleared his drafts. When Ingrid emailed the Ridgewood realtor behind my back, she didn't realize she was using the shared cloud. Everything they did, every move they made, I had tracked. I hadn't said a word. I just let them write the whole script. I was just the quiet man with the wrench in the garage until the ink dried. In the courthouse lobby, Klaus was wearing the same navy suit he wore at Oscar's last school recital. His tie was new, slick, and expensive. Ingrid stood next to him in a dull beige blouse, holding a thick binder she barely looked at. She was too busy scanning the hallway, waiting for the judge, or maybe looking for someone she could try to manipulate. I walked in alone. No lawyer, no briefcase, just a single envelope folded twice and tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket. They saw me and gave a quick nod. Klaus even offered a half-smile. "Dad," he said, walking over. "Thanks for coming. We want to resolve this with dignity." Dignity? That was a word he hadn't earned the right to use. "I'm here," I said simply. "That's enough." The judge was a tall woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back and glasses on the edge of her nose. When we were called in, she didn't look at me like I was a fossil to be ignored. She looked at me like I was the one holding the fuse. Ingrid's lawyer started in, his voice all polished tones and polished lies. "Your Honor, our position is that Mr. Ludwig Steiner, while undoubtedly a respected elder, has shown signs of cognitive decline. The clause he refers to was quietly reinstated without proper oversight, and our clients have every reason to believe the sale of the home was a necessary and mutually understood step for the family's well-being." The judge turned to me. "Mr. Steiner, do you have representation?" I stood. "No, Your Honor. But I do have something to submit." I reached into my jacket and handed her the envelope. She opened it, scanned the first few pages, and her brow raised just a bit. "These are emails?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor. They're dated, time-stamped, and verified between my son, his wife, and a real estate agent named Lena Wagner. They show intent to forge a sale without my consent, which is a direct violation of the deed's protective clause. There's also a notarized letter from the lawyer who refiled the clause last year, verifying my clarity of mind." Ingrid's face went white. Klaus's jaw got tight, but he didn't speak. The judge looked over the documents for a moment, then turned back to the opposing counsel. "Counselor, your clients will need to respond to this. But I'll tell you right now, if this documentation holds up, this isn't incompetence. This is deliberate deception." The rest of the hearing went like clockwork. The evidence was undeniable. My handwriting was consistent. The witness testimony from my doctor, submitted in an affidavit, said there were no signs of mental decline. And then came the emails, the final nail in the coffin. Klaus stared at them as the judge read excerpts aloud. "Once he's gone, we'll flip it within 60 days. Is that you, Mr. Steiner?" she asked. He didn't answer. She looked at Ingrid. His sentimentality is our biggest obstacle. He thinks this house means something. Is that you? Ingrid just blinked, too stunned to speak. The judgment was swift. The sale was blocked. The clause was upheld. The property was legally untouchable without my written approval. And I wasn't signing a thing. When it was over, I stepped outside into the cool air. Klaus followed. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking a little. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" I looked at him. Not mad, not sad, just tired. "I did. You weren't listening." Ingrid came up beside him. Her eyes were red and glassy around the edges. "So, what now? You're just going to what? Keep living in the garage? Play the victim?" "No," I said. "I'm going to live in the home I built. The home I bled for. The home you tried to sell like a used car." They didn't follow me to the parking lot. They didn't speak again. That night, I opened the last envelope, the one with no label. Inside was a letter to Helga. It was the letter I wrote the night after her funeral, but never had the nerve to finish. Old name, new name. Ryan Klaus. Sharon Ingrid. Ethan Oscar. Jack Ludwig. Elaine Helga. The Harrisons, the Steiners. Jack Ludwig. It talked about the man I was scared of becoming, and the kind of father I worried I was. The fear that I was invisible now that she was gone. But I wasn't invisible. Not anymore. I put the letter on her photo in the garage, right under the socket set. Then I went and made myself a fresh pot of coffee. I had a swing to paint for Oscar tomorrow, because one day he might need a place to remember where true love once stood. And I planned on being right here when he came looking for it. The morning after the hearing, I didn't sleep in. Old habits are tough to break. And besides, I had something I needed to do. The coffee maker sputtered to life in the kitchen. Yes, the kitchen, not the garage. For the first time in nearly a year, I let myself step across that invisible line, the one that ran between exile and home. The tile was cold on my feet, but the familiar creak of the cabinet, the one Helga always said she'd replace, made the house feel like a home again. I sat at the dining table alone. No sound of forks, no smell of pancakes from Ingrid, no cartoon laughter from Oscar. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator. And outside, the birds had started to chatter. I didn't mind the silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt earned. I pulled out a notepad. Not the yellow legal kind I used for evidence, but the brown leather-bound journal Helga had given me for our 25th anniversary. She said, "If you're going to be quiet all the time, at least let the pages know what you're thinking." I never used it back then. Now I had plenty to say. I wrote one word on the first page, reclaiming. Not revenge. Not justice. Just that one word. Then I heard the knock. 3 quick taps. I knew that rhythm. Oscar. I opened the door, and there he stood. His backpack was slung low, and his hair was a mess like he'd just run out of the house. His eyes flickered up to my face, looking for permission. "I told Mom I forgot my hoodie here," he said, but there was no lie in his voice. "She doesn't know I came over." I stepped aside, and he came in, quiet as a mouse. He didn't ask about the court. He didn't apologize. He just stood in the living room, looking around like he was trying to memorize every last detail. Then his eyes fell on the old photo wall, Helga, me, Klaus when he still smiled like a boy, and Oscar as a baby in my arms. He walked over and just stared for a long time. "She said you lied," he finally mumbled. But she was crying when she said it. I sat on the armrest of the couch. Sometimes people cry when the truth refuses to stay buried. He nodded slowly. Then, without looking at me, he asked, "Did you mean to lose everything just to keep this house?" I almost laughed. "No, I meant to keep this house to remember what everything once felt like." That seemed to make something click for him. He sat down beside me, his backpack still on. After a while, he asked, "Can I still use the garage?" I smiled. "Only if you help me repaint the swing this weekend." He grinned. "Deal." He left soon after. I watched him walk down the driveway, his shoulders a little taller than before. Later that day, a moving truck pulled into the cul-de-sac. Ingrid and Klaus were leaving. They didn't come by to say goodbye, and I didn't expect them to. Ingrid loaded boxes while Klaus stood by the mailbox, typing like a madman on his phone. No more smiles. No more casual waves. When the truck pulled away, I noticed the realtor's sign was gone. Good. That night, I opened the shed behind the house, the one nobody had used in years. Inside was Helga's old garden bench, a broken rake, and a wooden sign I'd carved the summer Oscar was born. It read, "The Steiners, where roots grow deep." I dusted it off, sanded the corners, and repainted the letters. Then I put it by the front steps under the porch light. I wasn't going anywhere. In the weeks that followed, neighbors started stopping by again. Mrs. Delaney brought over a lemon cake. Hank offered to help me fix the gutter. Even the postman lingered just to say, "Glad you're back inside, Ludwig." I hadn't realized how visible an absence could be until I came back. Oscar started visiting on Saturdays. We worked on small projects, fixing the birdhouse, replacing loose nails, replanting the rosemary bush Helga loved. He didn't say much, but he didn't need to. His being there was enough. One day he brought over a school assignment. Write about a place that feels like home. He showed me what he wrote, "My grandpa's garage." It's small and smells like sawdust, but it's where things get fixed. And sometimes that's all a place needs to be. I didn't cry, but I had to look away for just a moment. Months passed. I had lunch with Helga's sister on a Sunday. I went fishing alone on a Wednesday. I learned how to use a tablet on a rainy afternoon. I signed up for a veterans writing group. I turned the guest room into a little reading den. Life didn't explode with purpose. It settled. And in that settling, there was peace. Klaus never contacted me again. Ingrid sent a cold, formal email once about how she regretted that things had to get so legal. I didn't reply. But one day near Christmas, I got a card. No return address. Just a child's handwriting that read, "Thanks for the swing. Merry Christmas." Inside was a Polaroid. Oscar was bundled up in a red scarf, sitting on the freshly painted swing, his feet off the ground, mid-laugh. The garage was in the background. My garage. I pinned the photo to the fridge with an old magnet that said, "World's okayest dad." It felt perfect. One afternoon, I opened Helga's piano. Dust had settled on the keys, but the sound was still there, hesitant but true. I pressed a few notes, clumsy, raw, familiar. I kept playing. I wasn't the man I was a year ago. I wasn't trying to be the father Klaus remembered or resented. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. I was simply here. That spring, I repainted the fence. Not because it needed it, but because I wanted the house to look like someone loved it, because someone did. One morning, I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun creep through the trees. A neighbor walked by and called out, "Ludwig, you look like a man with plans today." I smiled. I'm just a man who stayed. And I meant it, because staying wasn't a weakness. It wasn't stubbornness. It was a choice. To remain when others run. To rebuild where others raise. To believe in memory without becoming its prisoner. And maybe, just maybe, to be remembered not for how loud you fought, but for how quietly you refuse to vanish.